Hello and welcome to the Washington Urban Debate League's Junior Varsity Video Series. Today, we're going to talk about charter schools. We'll introduce the concept of a charter school in greater detail. We'll introduce the affirmative case, go through how to extend it and win a debate, and lastly, help you answer this case when you are the negative. So, what is a charter school? Well, charter schools are a very popular part of the school choice movement. Originally, they were just traditional public schools and private schools, but other options have emerged in between, such as charter schools, school vouchers, and education savings accounts. Teachers originally expressed a desire to create small schools and test different innovations in education to see what was better for student learning. The idea is that if the innovations prove successful, the teachers and their students would return to the original school and everyone would adopt the successful reform. Lots of charter schools have emerged to test new educational philosophies, but none have re-merged with traditional public school systems. Milwaukee, New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and Detroit are the national leaders in the charter school movement, with the majority of their students now in charter schools. To fully define a charter school, it is a publicly funded school run by someone other than the local school district. Charter school administrators get funding from tax dollars through the local school district, usually on a per-pupil basis. Essentially, they get a certain amount of money per student they enroll. They have fewer regulations on how they educate students, but they're still responsible for passing certain evaluations, such as standardized tests. In most cities, like Washington, if a charter school doesn't succeed and get students to pass the evaluations after several years, the school is closed for being bad at its job. Students can choose to enroll in a public school administered by the local school district, or they can apply for entry at a charter school. So let's walk through this case, starting with inherency. As mentioned earlier, charter schools are not a major phenomenon across much of the country. The plan would dramatically expand charter schools to many new cities and counties. There are two additional pieces of inherency for this affirmative. The first is that charter schools can and do work with disadvantaged populations now, in limited numbers. And secondly, that Secretary DeVos and President Trump have already put charter schools on their agenda, though it hasn't happened yet. This means that some perception-based disadvantages are non-unique because they have already been suggested by the current administration as their ideas for education. Next, let's talk about solvency. This case is pretty simple. It only really has one central argument. Can charter schools provide a better education for disadvantaged students? If you win this claim, you win solvency for the affirmative case and a large portion of your advantages. Let's talk about the achievement gap advantage. The uniqueness is simple. Existing educational options are creating an achievement gap between students of color and white students, on average, of course, and between students of means and students living below the poverty line. These are usually measured by standardized tests, but can be seen in all sorts of other evaluations. The link is that charter schools can shrink the achievement gap between race and class, providing a better education than existing options. And the impact is that reducing the achievement gap can create social mobility and reduce poverty and racism in the status quo. You have to win not only that charter schools provide a good education, but they are specifically good at serving underserved populations in order to win this advantage. Now on to the economy advantage. A prominent study by McKinsey shows that a large achievement gap hurts our economy by wasting the potential productivity of the students who are left behind. It further argues that this achievement gap is relatively unique to the United States, hurting our economic competitiveness with other nations. The link is that charter schools can reduce the achievement gap increasing the economic productivity of poor and minority students. The impact is that economic stagnation during the Trump administration might cause him to lash out and launch a diversionary war to distract the population from the struggling economy. The idea of a diversionary war is a theory that political leaders can use a war, which will drum up patriotism and other sort of rallying and loyalty to the nation effects, to distract the populace from domestic problems here at home, such as the struggling economy, or in President Trump's case, any number of other problems that he has at the moment. You'll notice that this isn't actually a separate advantage. It's really just a different impact scenario to the achievement gap advantage, since the uniqueness and the link debate are largely the same, just expressed in different terms. So how do you win using this case? Let's walk through it. For the first affirmative constructive, be sure to read and highlight before you go into a round. Make sure you can read through the entire case before testing it, including both advantage scenarios. If you can't, I'd encourage you to leave out the economic scenario. Be conversational about what a charter school is and how it differs from a traditional public school. Also, be able to explain how and why they are effective at serving disadvantaged students better than traditional public schools. In the second affirmative constructive, it's always important to give an overview of the case. Here's an example. Charter schools are the best way to ensure that disadvantaged students get the best education by educating them in schools that use cutting-edge teaching methods. Reducing the achievement gap can solve structural harms in our society and will cause economic growth, reducing the likelihood of a diversionary war. This case is built around a single idea. Charter schools help disadvantaged students. Focus on this point and you will likely win the debate. As usual, answer the inherency and solvency arguments and extend your advantages. Read extra evidence to support this central claim if you have to. You can't win the debate without it. Lastly, be sure to answer off-case positions. In the first affirmative rebuttal, extend the central thesis of the affirmative in 1 to 2 sentences. Extend your inherency and solvency, answering any arguments from the block. Since there's really only one claim here, you must prioritize winning that charter schools work for disadvantaged populations, above all else. Lastly, choose an impact scenario, either diversionary war or structural violence, and extend it. Be sure to choose the argument you think you're winning, not just your favorite argument. And do impact calculus, comparing your affirmative to the negative's impacts. Be sure to answer any off-case arguments they make as well. In the 2AR, explain the central thesis of the affirmative and tell the judge that if you win this central claim, you win the debate. Extend and answer arguments on inherency and solvency from the 1AR, and extend arguments on your remaining impact scenario, doing impact calculus, including time frame, magnitude, and probability. Answer any off-case arguments. Make sure to leverage that the affirmative case is a big central question in education. Most negative outcomes that the other team might point out are inevitable if we don't solve the achievement gap. Furthermore, you could frame it that we have a moral obligation to resolve structural harms, giving you additional leverage against the negative. So how do you answer the charter school's affirmative when you have to debate against it? We'll walk through how to do so on case, and then walk through the off-case options. Let's talk about inherency. It is true that there are only a handful of cities that have embraced the charter school movement beyond a few scattered schools. However, that doesn't mean that it's not inevitable. There's a fancy term called attitudinal inherency, which refers to behavioral or attitude-based barriers to the affirmative happening. In this case, I don't see many, if any. Since President Trump, Secretary DeVos, and a bipartisan array of politicians support charter school expansion, and there's a consistent record of charter schools growing and expanding already, I just don't see a reason why we necessarily need the affirmative. We just need patience. When it comes to solvency, It's hard to figure out if charter schools, as a group, actually work. As charter schools are quite different from one another, inevitably some do well and some don't. As a result, the research on their success is mixed at best. So let's talk defense. Evidence exists that saying on average, charter schools aren't any better for students, especially for disadvantaged students. They don't actually innovate that much, especially when regulated. The offense is especially important here. Many charter schools have troubling admission or retention policies that prevent solvency and could be actually bad for students. For example, selective admission policies could only let in high-achieving students or could expel diverse or special needs students. Skimming is the term used for charter schools that only let in students that are likely to succeed or who are already high-achieving, leaving the truly struggling students in traditional public schools. This makes the charter schools look great, especially when compared to their local public schools, but it doesn't actually mean they're making a positive difference. When it comes to the achievement gap advantage, it's important to focus on the central tenet of the case. Are charter schools good or bad for students from disadvantaged backgrounds? Here's the defense. The charter schools can't solve the achievement gap, and the frequent closures and other regulations cancel out the benefits of charter schools. On offense, charter schools can increase racial segregation and can make the achievement gap worse. When it comes to the economy advantage or scenario, the defense is pretty clear. That Trump won't launch a diversionary war, and if he does, it will be small. There are framework cards allowing you to argue that extinction is more important than racism or structural violence. And on the democracy add-on, charter schools don't teach civics better than traditional schools, and since faith in democracy is at an all-time low, there's no impact. When it comes to offense, you'll have to go do some research on your own. I suggest going for arguments such as economic growth being bad or diversionary wars being good. Let's talk about some of the independent offense in this file. First is special education. Charter schools have a habit of kicking out SPED students or just simply leaving them behind without providing services they need to succeed. Charter schools can be accused of racism or classism, and this argument about skimming the best students from traditional public schools is especially damning. If charter schools are skimming the best students, they're not actually solving the achievement gap. If this segregation is bad for everyone involved, that's offense. If you aren't reading this argument against this affirmative case, you need to rethink your strategy. When it comes to off-case arguments, let's talk disadvantages. Charter school expansion will move a lot of money from local departments of education to charter school administrators, but it may not cost a whole lot of extra money, giving you a link to spending disadvantages. Check on the regulations in the plan text to see if they cost extra cash. When it comes to federalism, this case links hard. Charter school growth is a local initiative now, not a federal action. The trade-off disadvantage doesn't link well, since this isn't a curricular change. You can make it link with some extra research, showing that charter schools usually focus on a certain subject, but it will take extra work. Politics disads link really well. School choice is very controversial, especially as a federal program. Since Trump and DeVos are very unpopular, traditional advocates are scared of supporting school choice since they might get associated with Donald Trump and Secretary DeVos. There are lots of creative topicality violations that would prove this case is beyond the resolution. Go do some research and you'll be able to shock your opponents. When it comes to T-substantial, it might be useful for helping you win links, but this case proposes a large change. When it comes to T-education, school choice doesn't really fall under a narrow definition of education that is all about what happens in the classroom, since it's a lot more about funding and administrative changes. When it comes to counterplans, there are many ways to solve the achievement gap, many of which are mutually exclusive with charter school expansion. First, let's talk about the state's counterplan. The states can definitely expand to charter schools, and some are doing so now. This counterplan definitely solves the affirmative. The court's counterplan might work, but you'll need to do more research on how and what case to overturn. The plan-inclusive counterplan could also be a strong strategy. Choose to do some, but not all, of the plan. For example, you could ban skimming, but reduce other regulations to encourage innovation. Lastly, feel free to create your own counterplan once you get to varsity. Increasing Title I funding, school vouchers, or curricular reform could all solve the achievement gap, potentially better than the affirmative. This case links to all major criticisms. Let's walk through a few. When it comes to the capitalism critique, I don't think any case links better. The government is literally turning over control of public schools to private companies. They are creating new markets for these businesses, and the case is justified by increasing worker productivity. When it comes to the biopower critique, this likely works pretty well. The skimming arguments talk about how state action can organize populations into desirables and undesirables. I'd look into a range of identity and ethics critiques against a case like this if you're looking to strike out on your own.